For the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at an issue in the area of philosophy that's known as metaphysics. And this week, we're going to start by looking at the two ideas of dualism and physicalism. And next week, we're going to get onto functionalism and artificial intelligence. And as I'll suggest, part of the attraction of the works, the theories that we'll look at next week, is because both dualism and physicalism, I think, should really make us a little bit, maybe leave us feeling a little bit unsatisfied. They don't quite really express satisfactorily our deepest intuitions about the relation of what we're going to call mental events and the relation of those events to what we call physical events. When we talk about mental events and the mental, it's another way of talking about what we sometimes refer to as our mind, the fact that we have minds. And when we talk about minds, we don't mean the same thing as, although of course this is part of what's up for dispute here, we don't necessarily mean the same thing as when we talk about brains. The brain is a physical organ located in the body, located specifically in the head. And we can sort of open up our skull and take a look at our brain. However, that's not quite what we mean, not exactly the same thing as when we refer to us as having minds, at least in this debate. When we talk about ourselves as having minds, we mean our ability to think, to perceive, to wish, to imagine, all of those things that typically we do with our minds. So, one of the things we're going to have to sort out here is whether when we talk about minds we do after all just mean the same thing as brains. Is it the same thing? If there's a difference, what sort of a difference is it? And we often think that our minds is what makes us uniquely us. What makes us, in other words, uniquely the kind of individuals that we are, as distinct from all other individuals who have their own minds. So, historically, and I think still, it has an intuitive appeal and attraction to us. We've thought of ourselves as beings that are comprised that are made up of two separate components, almost sort of stuck or glued together. We're bodies and we're minds. That is, we're bodies plus minds. And in a lot of sort of science fiction, this is sort of played upon where we have, people's minds being extracted and sort of placed in another body or frozen and they're coming back to life or whatever. So there's a cultural sense that these two things are separate and what make us up, that we're bodies and then with minds attached to them. And of course this goes right back to, at least to Descartes. In its modern form, this idea of us as being made up of bodies plus minds, and Descartes has his own idea of how the two are supposed to be connected. One thing we're going to want to talk about during this debate is whether and to what extent this makes us different from other species. In other words, is it unique to human beings? And this is something that Descartes would have agreed with, and he would have said, yes, definitely it is. Is the fact that we have minds something that makes us different from all other species of animals, and all other living things? That's to say that are our minds something that separates us from the rest of the world, from the rest of physical reality? Do they make us different? And, if you want to say yes here, then what is it that makes human minds different? What makes them something else? Something that we don't find in the rest of the physical world. Some people would of course disagree and say no, that's not true, that animals have minds too, albeit of a different kind, perhaps even of a lesser complexity than human minds. But of course, throughout the physical world there are things of greater and lesser complexity. And to say that our minds are more complex doesn't necessarily mean that they're just not part of the physical world at all. So that's a debate as well that's central here. We're going to have to be as clear as we can when we talk about consciousness and we talk about mind. And of course, mind is often related with consciousness. When we say, what is it that makes that up our minds, it's what we're conscious of. When we're thinking, we're conscious of perceiving, we sort of, a mental event would be, I see the tree in front of me. And we're conscious of that perception, we're conscious of what it is that we see, and therefore that would be a mental event. Or I think, I think that the bus is coming. So that would be another sort of mental event that we can specify, we can sort of describe its content and talk about it, and we're conscious of it. In other words, if we think of consciousness as a sort of awareness, we're aware of having this thought, we're aware of having this idea, or we're aware of having this perception. So it's like a higher level of awareness of something, an event that's taking place within us. So these two terms are very, consciousness and mind are very much interlinked. So let's start by tackling dual. Now, as a way of getting into this, let's just start by taking a look at the questionnaire on page 199 of the textbook. And it's called a questionnaire on what's most real. If we think of metaphysics as trying to ask questions about the reality of something, about what kind of reality something has, what kind of existence it has, the manner in which it exists, the manner in which it is. A very abstract question, of course, but I think this is a nice way of looking at it, because we can really see the kind of categories that we use when we ask that question. We can see the ways in which we characterize things in terms of their reality. And sometimes, as I think becomes clear when we work through this questionnaire, we can see that a lot of the time we use different categorizations when we try to group these things into different sort of spheres of reality, and sometimes those things conflict. So let's see, and you can, in your own time, think about how you would sort of rank these as most real or less real. Let's just pick through them and see what we can illustrate as we go through. Your body, the first one, and the second one, your mind. Well, we may be inclined to say, think of how real your body is, in the sense that it's right before you and you can touch it, you can you can perceive it immediately there. It seems to be very real in that sense. You can point to it, and it has a distinctive smell and everything else. So your body is something that seems to be physically very real. But how would you categorize or classify the reality of your mind? Especially, how would you rank it, say, as more real or less real than your body? Of course, if you agree with Descartes, then you'll say, well, it's more real because it's the one thing that I am always certain of. I may be mistaken when I see when I see the body of another person. I may, if it's a sort of trick of the light, or I'm delusional or whatever, I may even, I may even mistake my own body being present when it's not. There's something called phantom limb syndrome, which illustrates that, where people who have had their limbs amputated, or a leg amputated, have sort of, have the sensation of the limb being still there when it's not. So those things suggest that there's something in Descartes' categorization, that there is a lot of reality in as regards the mind, and sometimes perhaps the body should have a second degree reality, even though it seems to be the most physically evident thing. That at least would be Descartes' perspective. Of course, Einstein's brain, again, it's a physical thing, we can see it. Einstein's ideas, of course, not themselves physical, but think about the effects and the changes that have been brought about by those ideas. Think about the very sort of real physical changes and real processes that have been made possible by Einstein's ideas. Number 5, electrons, is interesting as well. Obviously, we never see them directly, and physicists tell us that they're part of the essential building blocks of reality. That they're sort of the deeper reality of things. Yet, of course, we can never sort of perceive them with our eyes. We need special equipment to know that they are there. If you like, we only ever hypothesize that they are there. In other words, we assume that they're there because it explains, for physicists, it explains the way the physical universe behaves. It explains things like electricity and as well, of course. So, electrons, we assume that they, for physicists, of course, they're perhaps among the most real things that there is, but we don't see them directly. We may have very, very conflicting opinions about number 6, and we'll maybe leave that aside and come back to that when we look at the philosophy of religion. But again, people like Descartes would rate it very highly on the list of things that are most real. Number 7 or 8, we may be inclined to rate 8 less real than 7. Your car appearing in a dream is less real than your car. Perhaps again you could say, well, given that number 8 is a mental event, it may be something which we can't be confused about as such, because it is a mental event. In other words, we can't doubt that we're having that mental experience. Again, Descartes' idea. Whereas perhaps we may believe that we see our car, but in fact it's not really there. Now let's go on to number 10 and I think number 14. Beauty and justice are interesting, and if we think back to Plato here, we can see an interesting idea. A lot of us might say, perhaps, well, those things are a bit tricky because, of course, we never see them directly. We only see them as sort of how they're made concrete by particular examples. We never see beauty as such, but we might see it in a particular painting or in a particular person. We never see the idea of justice as such, but we might see it in a particular society. We might see an example of it in a particular society or group of people or a person, perhaps. So those two, we might say, well, they're a bit abstract because they're concepts. Of course, if you agree with Plato, you would say that those beauty and justice are in fact more real than ordinary physical things. And why is that? It's because they actually give sense to everyday physical things. In other words, if we didn't have the concept of beauty, we would never be able to distinguish particular physical things as beautiful, particular people as beautiful. We would be sort of lost at sea and unable to categorize things. For Plato, it's only because we have the category, because we have the category or concept of beauty and justice, that we can figure out what things really are in the world. So that's why for Plato those things are more real than all the other physical sort of things that seem to be real to us in our daily lives that we can perceive. So there's some interesting examples here, and it shows the different way we can categorize these, and ultimately, of course, this will depend on what philosophical theories we want to uphold and what sort of perspective we want to take on it philosophically. Now, the mind-body problem. So let's think about why this is called a problem, why it should be a problem at all. And in fact, it's become a problem because of the incompatibility of things that we are inclined to hold about the mind and the body. Firstly, the first proposition states the body is a physical thing. And remember, when we talk about the body, we include that very special bodily organ in our skulls that's called the brain. Within that definition, the brain is part of the body. We believe that the body is a physical thing. Okay? We believe that it's part of the physical universe. It's subject to physical laws. Okay? So, everything else that holds about other physical things, the laws of cause and effect and gravity and everything, the body is subject to all of those laws. Now, secondly, it's held that the mind is a non-physical thing. It's a non-physical thing. Why is it thought to be? Well, because when we talk about mental events, we don't think of them as occurring in physical space, right? We don't think of them as located in the physical world. For example, it makes sense to say, point to something occurring in your brain, right? Point to your brain state, or point to your lower cortex, or whatever. It doesn't make sense to say, point to your thought about what you're going to have for dinner tomorrow. When we talk about thoughts or wishes or other mental events or perceptions, if we can't locate those things in physical space. And the very simple way to think about that is, if you opened up if you wouldn't recommend it, but if you opened up your skull and you had a look inside and you said, alright, now I'm thinking of what I'm going to have for dinner tomorrow. Where is my thought? Well, you can look all you want in your mind, and you can turn it over, you can rummage through it as much as you like in your brain, I should say. You can rummage through your skull. You're never going to find that thought. You're never going to come across it and say, oh look, here it is. So we believe that mental events are non-physical. We can't find them in physical space. They don't have physical dimensions. Thirdly, we believe, or people certainly that are dualists believe, that the mind and body interact and causally affect one another. And that makes sense because when we talk about our thoughts, we think about them causally affecting things that we do in the world. For example, I might think to myself, well, I think I think I've been eating too much recently, and I think I'm just going to have a salad for dinner tomorrow. At the moment, that's a thought. But of course, I believe that by having this sort of mental thought, I may be able to change my behavior tomorrow. I may be able to change what my body does tomorrow. That it, picks up a salad at the dinner counter instead of picking up the usual pizza or hamburger or whatever. So my mental thoughts change my behavior. When we have mental events, we think that affects what we can do, right? They causally interact, right? In other words, they're not just separate substances and separate worlds that never touch one another. Our minds influence what our bodies do. Similarly, what happens to our body can cause mental events. For example, I feel a pain in my arm and I think to myself, well, I think I'm going to go to the doctor tomorrow. So the relation between physical events and mental events is one where they interact and affect one another. Now here's where that comes into conflict with number 4, and here you can see the conflict, the contradiction is very direct. Fourthly, we believe that non-physical things cannot causally interact with physical things. Now, why might we believe that to be true? Largely because the physical universe runs according to laws and doesn't really leave room for exceptions. In other words, there are no gaps within the physical universe. Things are caused by other physical events, and there's no room for us to say, well, here that there was a little gap in the causal chain where a non-physical thing had an effect that made this physical thing happen. The physical universe, in other words, is a complete interlinked whole, and it doesn't leave room for non-physical things to have an influence, to have an effect. And of course, part of the issue here is that it's very difficult for us to say and to conceive exactly how non-physical things might causally interact with physical things. How does that interaction take place? By what means do non-physical things causally interact? So there's a lot of problems with assuming that. Now, some of you might say, well, there are psychic phenomena and everything else, and we shouldn't just throw out the idea of some kind of non-physical forces out there. That's fair enough. However, one thing I'd say is that when we try to give explanations like this, we want to make them as unassuming and simple as possible. In other words, the theory that we want about the mind-body problem is the one that allows us to hypothesize, to suggest the least degree of complexity possible. And ideally, in a theory, we don't want to have to make assumptions that are just very difficult to justify. In other words, what I'm saying is that if we can get out of this problem without having to say that there are non-physical things interacting with the physical universe, if we can get out of this problem by avoiding that assumption, that would seem to be the most, not only the most easy, but the most potentially successful route to take. So, here's what we have to deal with. It seems that we want to say that mind and body interact. And that was something that, as a dualist, of course, Descartes believes. It's something that seems to us straightforward. On the other hand, we also believe that it's very difficult to see how non-physical things can causally interact with physical things. It's difficult to see how that takes place. So that's our problem. And both dualism and physicalism are different responses to it. Now, Descartes, of course, is the most famous dualist, and he provides that argument in the Meditations. The difference between a mental substance, that is a thinking substance, and a physical substance, that is sort of what he calls the extended substance, the extended world. In other words, things that the world that occurs in space, the world that occurs that is located in external space, and we can see it and measure it and sort of predict its motion and sort of see causes and effects and everything else. When Descartes said he could not doubt the proposition I exist, of course he meant himself as a mental substance, separate from his body. For us to understand Descartes, it's important to see that he prepared the path for modern science. At the same time as doing that, he wanted to retain the idea of human freedom and religious truth. So, Descartes, really, it's this sort of big historical, cultural conflict, and Descartes is a part of that. But there comes a point where, modern science seems to come into a conflict with our ideas of human freedom and religious truth, insofar as modern science seems to take away, to an extent, our ability to believe in those things, our ability to endorse those things, because there's no room for human freedom within the physical world. Of course, if we think of everything in terms of causes and effects, then everything that we do is caused just like everything in the physical universe is caused. There seems to be no room for a sphere of human freedom that is separate from the laws that affect all other things in the universe. Now, Descartes, in effect, sort of preserves modern science as what applies to the external substance, what he calls res extensa, the external world. At the same time, he suggests that we can retain the idea of human freedom and, of course, the idea of religious truth that pertains to what we can know as mental substances, in other words, as thinking substances. So Descartes, creates or constructs a philosophy where these two things can coexist side by side, and he does that by dividing up the world into these two substances. Res extensa is the realm of modern science. The thinking substance, what he calls the cogito, that is the realm of human freedom. That is how we know, that is how we are able to, as thinking substances, exercise our freedom unconstrained by what is going on in the external, extended world. Now let's take a little bit more of a closer look at Descartes' arguments for dualism. All of his arguments, in fact, are premised on what's called the principle of the non-identity of discernibles. That principle basically says, and it's really straightforward if we just think it through. It says that if two things do not have exactly the same properties, they are not the same thing. So if two things do not have exactly the same properties, they are not the same thing. Okay? So, in other words, if we have two things, right, say in this case we're talking about mind and a body, okay? If we can find a property that applies to one of these two things, a property that it has, and that property does not apply to the other thing, then we can say that these two are different things. They're different substances. That's the principle. Now, we'll see that the way that Descartes applies this principle is a bit suspect, but in itself, the principle seems to be valid. Right? If we have a property that one of the things has, but the other thing that we're looking at doesn't, then they're different things. So, if we can find a property possessed by the mind but not by the body, or the other way around, if we can find a property possessed by the body but not by the mind, we will have proved that the mind is a separate substance from the body. Let's look at each of the arguments that Descartes gives for this principle. And as we'll see, each of those arguments will focus on, one of them will focus on doubt, one of them will focus on divisibility, and the third one will focus on consciousness. So let's take a look at these arguments in turn. Very simply, Descartes lays out the argument from doubt about this, and this goes back to the argument we looked at when we looked at Descartes' epistemology. Descartes says, for the reasons we gave, sense experience, dreaming, the malicious demon, I can doubt that my body exists. Okay? I can doubt that my body exists. He says, like we saw, I cannot doubt my mind exists. In other words, even when I'm doubting, I'm thinking, therefore I am still a thinking substance. So I can always doubt my body exists, I cannot doubt my mind exists. Now here's the principle of the non-identity of discernibles. If two things do not have the same properties, then they cannot be identical. Therefore, the mind and body are not identical. Now, on the surface, this might look like a straightforward application of that principle. In other words, the fact that I can doubt my body but I can't doubt my mind seems to suggest a different property between the body and the mind. But does it? Does it really suggest a property that's different between these two things, or does it tell us something else? In other words, does it tell us about how we perceive it, rather than actually being a property of those things themselves? Well, let's see if we can sort of put this argument on top of it and see if this works as well. And I think this has the same error as Descartes' argument above. Suppose we say this. Number one, I believe that Elton John is a very accomplished musician. Number two, I do not believe that Reginald Dwight is a very accomplished musician, because I've never heard of him. Number three, if two things do not have exactly the same properties, then they cannot be identical, right? Again, the principle of the non-identity of discernibles. Number four, therefore, and here's where we simply conclude again, Elton John and Reginald Dwight are not identical. Seems to make sense, until we realize that Elton John is the stage name for Reginald Dwight, hence they're both exactly the same person. So it seems that here we've got a case where the argument of the principle of the non-identity of discernibles has been misapplied. Right? The fact that I believe Elton John is accomplished, the fact that I don't believe Reginald Dwight is a very accomplished musician, is because I just don't know who Reginald Dwight is. Right? In other words, the problem lies in what I believe. Right? And that's what makes the argument not work here. It's a misapplication of that principle. The same could be said of Descartes' argument. The fact that I can doubt my body, I cannot doubt my mind, may be just something about the way that my mind causes me to think about these things. It may be just that I'm sort of misled into thinking that there's a difference here when in fact there isn't. So we have to be very careful about how we take that argument. In fact, we should take it with quite a large grain of salt. Let's look at the argument from divisibility. This is the second argument that Descartes gives. And it says, and let's lay out the argument again. Number one, the body is divisible. Number two, the mind is indivisible. In other words, it can't be divided, it can't be split into pieces. Right? If we have a thought, the idea here is if we have a thought, then we have, it's a single unique thought. We can't sort of chop it into pieces. We can't segregate a part of it off. So the mind is something that we can't sort of divide, right? In other words, each of us has a mind, and it can't be sort of divided into parts, right? We can't sort of split somebody's mind in two and make two people. So here's the principle again. If two things do not have exactly the same properties, then they cannot be identical. Therefore, the mind and the body are not identical. Well, how does this principle stand? Is it true? Well, just as an example, some people would question the idea that the mind is indivisible and cannot be divided. And of course a common sort of psychological example that we're familiar with that I think illustrates that is the idea of the split personality, where we can have a person who's sort of dividing themselves into multiple different personalities, two or in extreme cases, multiple personalities. And there are, those are psychologically documented cases of that being true. So we have to be careful when we say the mind is indivisible. Exactly what do we mean by that? Exactly what do we mean by that principle? And it may be that the more we know about human psychology, that principle becomes less and less plausible. Now the third argument is the argument from consciousness, and this may be perhaps the most promising of Descartes' arguments. Descartes was one of a great many people, in fact, who have believed that the mind is different from everything in the physical world because it is consciousness, because it is conscious. It has consciousness. Now, what exactly does this mean when we talk about consciousness? And if we say it's a different thing, then we have to be clear that what we're saying is that it's a property that is absolutely separate from the physical world. In other words, there's no way of sort of getting to consciousness by increasing the complexity of a physical arrangement. Consciousness is just something that we cannot get to by greater physical complexity. And again, part of the problem with this argument, the main issue seems to be that, again, brain science seems to be sort of telling us a lot about how the complexity of the brain can provide, sort of functions that go beyond other less complex physical mechanisms. And again, next week, we're going to raise the issue of whether we can ever say that computers have minds in the same sense that we are. Can we talk about consciousness of forms of artificial intelligence? So, are there degrees of consciousness? Well, at first it strikes us that perhaps no, there aren't. We're either there or we're not there, right? We're either conscious or we're not. So we either have consciousness as a property, or it's something that we don't have. And if we don't possess it, then we're mere sort of physical organisms, mere physical systems. And again, that's how Descartes thought about animals, that they're simply bodies, they're sort of mechanical structures that don't have consciousness and don't have minds. Now, one thing we might want to bear in mind here is that there may be cases where we do exhibit degrees of consciousness. Think about a drug like alcohol, where, as I'm sure those of us who have experience with alcohol will be aware, that it is something that very much seems to change our consciousness. In fact, changes our awareness. Obviously, done to excess, it has a very radical change on our consciousness, that we do things we don't know we've done, and often very unfortunate things. However, this is the thing here, that it seems to lessen our degree of consciousness. It seems to make us to lessen our awareness of self, our consciousness of ourselves. So could it be that consciousness is something that is simply a result of physical complexity? In other words, are there degrees of consciousness? Are we more or less conscious? There may be, intuitively that may make more sense when we think about it. Think of a lot of the time when we do things, we're not really conscious or thinking about what we're doing. For example, when we're brushing our teeth, we probably do it, might say we do it on autopilot. We do it without thinking about it. And maybe a lot of our waking life, maybe even most of our waking life, is made up of those sort of tasks. Things that we're doing without necessarily thinking about what we're doing. We almost say we do them unconsciously, or we do them mechanically. Okay? So we could even say, how important is consciousness to who we are, and how important is it to us as human beings? Can we inflate the importance of consciousness? Does it deserve to have such an importance? Is it key to our minds? Is it key to who we are as people? So there are a lot of questions here. However, the fact of us being conscious, the fact of us being aware of what we're doing, is something that I think is very important. Is a very important principle, and it's something that philosophers are always trying to figure out what this principle is. Now let's turn our attention to look at physicalism. Physicalism tells us very simply that there is one and only one physical material substance. And this is all we need to explain the mental abilities of human beings. Mental abilities including thinking, perceiving, and consciousness, and everything else. So, in other words, there are not two substances, a physical and a mental substance, a body and a mind. There is only a physical material substance, and the mind is made up of the way this physical material substance works. It's not a separate thing, it's not a separate substance. Our increasing knowledge of how the brain functions especially has made physicalism very popular in the last 100 years. It's grown in popularity as we've become more aware about the complexity of the brain and brain function, and the importance of the brain to our mental life, and we'll talk about that. That it seems harder, given all we know about neuroscience, for us to separate completely the brain and the mind as though they were in different universes. There seems to be a very strong connection between what we mean by the brain and what we mean when we talk about the mind, to such an extent that physicalism says, look, it's all about the mind, it's all about the brain, that the brain is the key to understanding our mental functions, and if we understand the way this organ works, we'll see that its particular physical material makeup tells us all that we need to know about our mental life. Partly the attraction of physicalism comes from a number of problems, or what are perceived problems, with the idea of dualism. And those problems are really fourfold. There are four specific things that we can look at. And the first thing is, and this is a problem for Descartes of course as well, is where does the interaction between the mind and the body take place? Descartes famously suggested it's the pineal gland located at the base of the skull at the back. A famously wrong argument in this case. But if that's wrong, then we still need to answer the question: where does interaction take place? How exactly does the mind influence the physical system, the brain in the skull and the rest of our central nervous system? What does the mind do to have an effect, to have an influence on the brain, given that the mind is a separate substance? And the second related question: how does interaction occur? We think of physical events as occurring by the employment of force. That is to say, it occurs by physical things impinging on other physical things and transferring energy to those things. So we know about how interaction occurs in the physical universe, and our sort of idea of force enables us to explain that. Things are sort of pushed or pulled very simply, and in physicist terms, of course, they would have more complex ways of talking about it, but that's the essential idea, that things transfer energy to other things in the physical system. But how exactly do non-physical things have an influence on physical things? It can't be in the same way as physical things, otherwise they would be physical themselves, right? So how exactly do non-physical things interact and cause effects to occur in physical things? The third thing asks us, what about the conservation of energy? And this is the basic scientific principle that ask any of your science teachers, and they will tell you that a fundamental principle is the law of the conservation of energy. In other words, energy never sort of disappears, or it never originates from nothing. Energy in any physical event or interaction is always conserved, right? It's always transformed into another form. Okay. Now, if we have a non-physical event occurring, it seems to, or if we have a physical event set in motion by a mental event, right? Say my my mental event that I'm going to have a salad tomorrow, setting in motion my physical event to pick a salad off the shelf. If we say that the mental event is a non-physical event, and then it has an effect, it changes the way my body works, we've broken the principle of the conservation of energy, right? We've suggested that something that's non-physical has caused a change, has introduced energy into the physical system. That seems to run contrary to our sort of whole principle of how the scientific world works. Okay? Now, I'm not necessarily saying here that therefore we give up dualism necessarily, or that we therefore say it's incoherent. What these objections, I think, what all of them are trying to get at is that it is a very difficult assumption for us to make, to assume that there's a physical substance and a non-physical substance. It's just a very difficult assumption to make. There are a lot of problems with assuming that this is how things are. And I think the attraction of physicalism is largely because of that, and because of its greater simplicity, the fact that it avoids making these assumptions. It avoids getting into this sort of trouble that dualism gets into. The final thing that sort of pegs on those, piggybacks on those three is the success of brain science. And in the textbook there's the very famous case on page 220 about Phineas Gage, who had an injury, a very sort of severe injury, iron rods sort of penetrating his skull, and very nasty injury, where a change to his brain, and I think we're very familiar with these things nowadays, a change to his brain, a severe brain injury, caused a complete change in Phineas's personality. So Phineas became a different person. So a physical sort of injury, a physical injury to his brain led to him becoming having a completely different mind, if you like. It led to him becoming a completely different person. So here we want to say, well, if that's the case, that if a physical event can do this, then what is the separate thing about the mind that we need to hold on to? Why not just say that everything's physical, right? Why not just say that the mind is physical, and that's why a physical event here, a brain injury, had such an effect on Phineas Gage's mental life, right? So it suggests that that the physical world is the key to everything that happens in the mind, and that's that's what brain science and the success of brain science really, the threat that it holds to dualism. So like I said, it's really when we look at these four problems, we want to think about the very severe problems they pose for any dualist solution. They suggest that there's a very large barrier that any dualist theory has to get over. And so the implication is, well, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to tackle these problems at all? Wouldn't it be much better if we could solve the problem more simply? Now, there are two versions of physicalism, and the first one is called identity theory. Identity theory says that mental states are identical to brain events. In other words, they are another way of talking about events that happen in the brain, right? So they're identical to brain states. In other words, if you look in your brain and you see there's a particular state, right? Neurons are sort of firing or interacting with one another, transferring chemicals at a certain place. That particular brain event is equivalent to a particular mental event. Whether it's I see the Empire State Building, or whether it's I think that I'm going to take another philosophy class next semester. When we have a physical event, it equates to a physical event in the brain. It equates to a particular mental event. They are the same thing, right? It's just another way of talking about that physical event. So, our thought, right? Suppose you have a thought. Here is the Empire State Building, right? That's a mental event. It's your mental thought. I am thinking of the Empire State Building, right? So it's mental. It's not. We're talking about it in terms of an event happening in our mind. Now, identity theory says that thought is equivalent to a particular brain state. right? It's equivalent to, it's the same thing as, it's another way of talking about an event occurring within this, squishy grey organism in our skulls that's called the brain. In a particular place in the brain, there is a transfer of energy. Neurons are firing, as scientists say. A transfer of energy is occurring. There's something happening. That event, that state, is equivalent to the thought, I am thinking of the Empire State Building, right? So it's a brain state. To call it a mental state is simply to talk about the brain state in a different way. Okay, so that's what identity theory says, that a particular mental state, my thought, my wish, my desire, whatever, all of those distinct events are equivalent to a particular brain state. Okay, they're the same. Now we can think of eliminativism, it's a bit of a mouthful to say, as a sort of more aggressive form of physicalism than identity theory. Identity theory says we can still talk about mental states and mental things. We just have to bear in mind that it's just another way of talking about brain states. Eliminativists say that our mental talk is an inaccurate way of talking about brain states. In other words, our everyday talk is basically should be seen as a form of folk psychology, right? So that's to say that when they call it folk psychology, that they mean it's like talk, when in previous times people talked about things like witches because they didn't understand how personality disorders work, right? So they sort of said witches, people were possessed, and so on and so on. Nowadays, that we know that rather than talking about witches, we talk about personality disorders and mental disorders that can be attacked by drugs. And that we can tackle by different sorts of psychotic drugs and so on. We no longer talk about witches, right? So that talk has disappeared. It was an inaccurate way of talking about mental disorders and mental diseases. Eliminativists believe that a lot of our mental talk is like that too. That when we say, I see, or I think, or I wish, when we use those sorts of mental talk, we're just talking in an inaccurate way about brain states. That if we were more accurate, instead of saying I think that I will have something else for dinner tomorrow, instead of saying that, we will say my brain in the sort of lower right cortex is firing neurons at a certain rate towards the sort of lower left cortex or whatever. So instead of talking about it that way, we would simply talk about brain states. Of course, we're not all scientists, so we don't do that. But they say that our mental talk, is misleading and it's inaccurate. That it sort of takes us away from the fact that what we're dealing with here are physical states. Now, I want to leave us with this thought. Do we have to be dualists or physicalists? And in a sense, you might say, well, yes, we do, because we either believe that there are two substances or there's one, right? That minds and brains are either completely different substances, and a physical and a non-physical, or there's just physical things. In a sense, you might say that's right. However, I think we can still raise the question of whether, by suggesting that these are our two only options, that we sort of we're mischaracterizing really the debate and what the essential thing is about the mind when we talk about it in terms of these two options. And as we'll see, functionalism, which we'll look at next week, tries to look at the mind in a different way, not as simply about states and intentional states, but as a way of doing things. So it may be that to suggest that these are our two options is really, neither of them maybe really gets to the heart of what the subject is about. And I think both of these options leave us thinking that we haven't quite satisfied what's at stake. Dualism, like I said, seems to become less plausible the more that we know about the connection between the brain and our mental life, the more that there seems to be a strong connection there. But at the same time, physicalism, I think, in my experience, physicalism seems to a lot of people not to take seriously enough what's unique about our mental life. The fact that it seems to us meaning as we're living it, the fact that it seems so different from the physical world around us. The fact that we have a mental life, that we're conscious, that we can have thoughts and ideas that we're conscious of, that seems to be something that it's difficult to reduce to the operation of the ordinary, the everyday physical world that we see around us. That seems to separate us off. It seems to be a sort of unique enclave, if you like, within that world. So physicalism doesn't seem to take seriously what is unique and original about our mental life, how it seems to us, right? How it seems to us different from the physical world around us. So I want you to end this week's presentation, think about dualism and physicalism. Think about how you relate to these options, whether you're convinced by dualism or whether you would incline more to be a physicalist, or whether in fact also you find either of these options satisfactory or satisfying. And if you don't, think about what you think is missing in these views of our mental life. Is there something that we're not taking into account here? Is there something that sort of goes missing in both these accounts? So have a think about that and sort of figure out where you stand in terms of dualism, which talks about two substances, but like we said has problems, and physicalism, which sort of doesn't have the same sort of large-scale problems as dualism, at least, that doesn't have the same really almost unanswerable problems like interaction, where does the interaction occur, and all those questions. At the same time, physicalism leaves a lot of people, I think, thinking that something about our mental life has been left out. So that's where we'll leave things this week.